Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So now that we have finished Frankenstein and To His Coy Mistress, it's time to jump back into our textbook, as I've mentioned. So this week we are reading chapter 2 in the book, which begins on page 17. And it's all about the traditional approaches to literature, traditional approaches to the study and analysis of literature. So this is a nice sort of background bit of information that we need before we can really jump into the modern schools of literary criticism that we have today. So this is almost like a prehistory, an origin story that kind of tells you a little bit more about the history of literary study, and it also tells you a little bit more about how things have changed in the last 100 years or so. The way we study literature now is quite different than the way they used to do it, using a lot of these traditional approaches. But we haven't lost all of these traditional approaches. We still utilize some of this stuff today, and we'll see just how that goes as we get on into lecture. But there's a lot of history here about literary study, how it used to be, how it's developed, and how it's kind of changed, in the more modern sense, like I said. So they do talk about that in the book. They talk about it in chapter 2. We don't necessarily need to be experts on the history, but some of this stuff is useful to know. And obviously, we can imagine that literary criticism or the study of literature has been around as long as literature has been around. So we've talked about this before. Literature has a very long history. We can go back to ancient societies and find examples of plays, poems, epics, which were a type of poetry, but that might read more like a novel to modern readers, very lengthy narratives. So they had literary traditions going back to ancient times. And just like they had literature back then, they also had people talking about literature, writing about the literature, arguing about it, praising it, complaining about it, but also doing the kind of work that we will be doing in this class, interpreting the literature, trying to understand what it says, what it does, and why it matters. So these kinds of impulses, these kinds of moves have been made for a long time. So we've had the study of literature just as long as we've had literature. But one key point that the book tries to get across in chapter 2, and it's worth knowing, is that for a long time, works of literature were thought to be sort of like vehicles. They delivered meaning, they delivered some important truths, some important ideas, but oftentimes the way people studied literature, like, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, they would have often been more centered or more focused on other things. So if the literature is the vehicle, the real sort of featured attraction, the real subject of analysis would be, the history that the literature shed light on, or the biography of the author, or certain philosophical or moral truths or principles that the work of literature might have been sort of working to express. So that's the way a lot of people would have approached literature in olden times. That's what they tell us in the book. Like, they would have appreciated the literature, but they would have viewed it, again, as a vehicle to that would allow us to access the really important disciplines, or the really important fields of study, or academic fields like history, linguistics, biography. Those things were given priority over the actual work of literature. More often than not, that was kind of the way it worked for a long time. According to the book, this really remains the case up until about the 19th century. And towards the end of the 19th century, maybe the beginning of the 20th century, we start to move away from that traditional way of approaching literature, where it's a vehicle, it's a means to an end. And again, it's going to shed light on something that might be deemed more important, like history, philosophy, moral lessons, the life of the author, if the author was famous, stuff like that. And pretty soon, roughly 100 years ago, maybe a little more, we had more and more critics and scholars starting to say, no, these works of literature have inherent value. They are works of art, very similar to plays, very similar to visual art like paintings that we might see in a museum. They are worthy of study as art. Now, we take this for granted today because this newer approach to literature eventually won out. As they tell us in chapter 2, we can really thank the new critics or the formalists. We're going to learn a lot more about them next week when we read the chapter about formalism. But this was one of the first real modern critical schools to emerge in America roughly 100 years ago. Many of them were college professors, and they really made this argument that, when we study a poem or a novel, we should just regard it as a work of art completely separate from stuff like history, biography, philosophy, all of those earlier lens or frameworks that critics would have used to approach the literature. The new critics didn't have much use for that. They especially didn't care about biography. They didn't really care about the author's life story. They just wanted to focus on the text itself, whether it was a poem, the written form of a play, a novel, a short story, whatever. They said, we can just stay in the text. We can just deal with what's happening in the text. We don't always have to move outside of the text to talk about something else. And that was typically how things were done. So they mentioned this, or like on page 18, they mentioned this divide, this split that sort of occurs in the early 20th century between these new types of critics who really think that literature is just valuable in and of itself as a great work of expression, a great way of humans expressing themselves, works of art that can be studied, interpreted, understood, separate from all other disciplines, versus the older school of critics who were like, no, the literature is a vehicle to these other things. So again, if we're looking back on that now from our modern position, we can say the new critics kind of won that argument, because the way we study literature today has a lot more to do with more modern schools of criticism than it does to some of these older, more traditional forms. And you guys will notice that as we go through the traditional approaches today that they discuss in chapter 2, because a lot of this stuff is not really going to sound familiar. It's not really the type of work that we do anymore. But some of it will strike you as familiar. I think most of it won't, but some of it will. And some of it will still be useful as we move forward. So we'll talk more about that. And again, just a reminder, as you're reading chapter 2, make sure to pay attention when they start talking about their, favorite 6 works of literature that we've talked about, Frankenstein and To His Coy Mistress included. Make sure you read sort of how they run through those texts and try on a couple of these traditional approaches to apply to the texts. So at least check that out for Frankenstein. I believe that starts, well, first, I think you see it with To His Coy Mistress on page 23. So they try out a couple of traditional approaches on that poem. And then on page 29, they're going to try out some traditional approaches on Frankenstein. So you can skip over the other text if you didn't get a chance to read them. Those examples might not mean much to you, but since we did read the poem To His Coy Mistress and then the novel Frankenstein, let's at least look at those examples. And we can look at examples of those every time we read a chapter. As we see, you'll get used to the structure of these chapters. They're always going to use those texts as examples when they're trying out these different critical approaches. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the specific traditional approaches that they go through in chapter 2. Because again, some of these we're not really going to use at all, and we can just sort of learn a little bit about them and then put them aside. And then others could be valuable for us at times in various ways. So we'll start with textual scholarship. This is the first one they discuss in chapter 2. And this is, I mean, when we talk about being focused on the text, they are literally focusing on the text here as a sort of material object that has a life of its own and sort of a story of its own. So, with really old school traditional textual scholarship, scholars are really trying to find the most authentic or definitive version of a text. So you can maybe imagine this kind of work getting done a lot in earlier times where we had older texts that often had many different versions or editions. So we might associate this with older authors like Shakespeare or Chaucer. And there were a lot of different editions of their work. So, oftentimes, a big task for scholars or critics was to kind of comb through a lot of different editions, different manuscripts, sort of tracking the history of the actual like composition of the literature, sort of figuring out if it has been altered or corrupted over the years. So we can still do this kind of work with contemporary texts, but it's typically done more with older texts that might have more complicated and longer publication histories. So this is really hands-on sort of detective work, figuring out kind of what is that definitive version that's the closest to the author's original intention. So we do still see this today. It's not totally obsolete, but a lot of literary scholars wouldn't necessarily do that kind of work anymore. That might be left to historians. Maybe different disciplines would tackle a little bit more of that. Sometimes this is likened almost to, if you guys are movie buffs, this is likened to a director's cut. If you guys know what I mean by that, like sometimes you'll get a version of a movie like the commercially released version that plays in movie theaters, and that's the version that most people know. But then we might learn that that's not the version that the director really wanted. Like the director actually had another hour of footage and a whole nother subplot that ended up getting cut because the studio thought it was too long and they wanted to keep it under 2 hours or whatever. There's lots of stories like that with movies. And oftentimes the director might go back later, or they might just hang on to that original version, the longer version, the director's preferred version that doesn't get released, and that might come out later. So that's happened with a lot of famous movies like Blade Runner, and there's a lot of other examples where you get a director's cut that comes out after the theatrically released version. And sometimes they might even eventually play the director's cut in theaters much later, but it's often going to be a little bit different than the version that actually got released to the public the first time. So there can be some interesting stuff to observe there, like differences, again, sort of tracking any potential corruption or alterations that might have occurred. So we can do that work, but we're often going to do it with older texts. Um, all right, so we might use some of that. I doubt it. But you guys could certainly be interested in that if you're really interested in the material life of a work of literature, like its real existence as a physical thing. That can be interesting, another sort of interesting lens to use, but certainly not as common anymore. The second approach that they talk about in chapter 2 is genre study, or we could call it genre criticism. So this is one that I would recommend keeping in mind. This is a traditional approach that really has aged pretty well, and we still use it to varying extents today. So we all have a sense of genre, and they talk a little bit about the history of genre and how it really dates back to ancient Greece and thinkers like Aristotle. Aristotle actually was able to define a lot of important narrative concepts that we still use today. Now, we use some of them a little bit differently. There's, some stuff gets lost in translation, but we still use a lot of those concepts. He really helped to define the basic parameters of tragedy, which was one of the most popular forms of art and literature in ancient Greece. So tragedies were types of plays that would be put on for paying audiences, just like plays still work today. But of course, eventually they would also be written down. That's what makes plays interesting. There's the written component along with the performed live component. But Aristotle was really thinking about tragedy, thinking about plays when he defined a lot of these terms, but they really refer to almost any type of narrative. Really, like he kind of helps to define what a plot is, what characters are. He talks about theme. He sort of calls it, thoughts, like the primary thoughts that a text is trying to get across. And that's still largely how we think about theme. He talks about diction. He talks about melody, referencing music, because there was usually a musical accompaniment to theater back in ancient Greece. And he also talks about spectacle, which we still very much like, big sort of exciting moments that still play out in a lot of movies, a lot of literature today. And he also talks about the notion of mimesis, which is kind of important. It's another thing that we take for granted today because we're so accustomed to it. But he really helped to sort of define it and make it commonly understood. So mimesis is just the basic idea that works of literature are like imitations of real life, real actions. They're not real, but they're meant to seem real. So this is kind of an understanding that any movie audience will have, or any group of people that might read a book or consume any work of literature. We pretty much know that. Without having to know that term. We might not know the term mimesis, but we know that literature is often depicting things that aren't real, but they seem like they could be real. That's kind of the deal that we're making with the author or the director of the film. Is sometimes referred to as suspending your disbelief. It's this idea that you're going to kind of accept what you see as real, or you're going to sort of respond to it the way you would respond to something real, but all along that it's not real. But it's similar often to things that are real. So it's actually kind of a weird sort of bit of mental gymnastics that we have to go through, but we're very accustomed to it because we've had literature for a long time. So humans have adapted. We've learned how to consume literature. And now it's pretty much second nature. But there is a history to all of this stuff. And, humans kind of had to learn that. It's not necessarily natural. As we advanced and had more complex societies, we developed literature and we developed the ability to understand literature, to understand what literature's doing. It's often sort of showing us true things, but it's fiction. Right. And we understand that implicitly thanks to thinkers like Aristotle and those that have come after him. So, with genres, he also helped to define some major genres that we still have today. And we've mentioned that in ancient Greece, they had some of the main types of literature that we still have today. If we're thinking about the major genres of literature, like in a really macro sense, we would look at poetry, which is arguably the oldest, and then, theater, the plays, like we've been talking about. The ancient Greeks had both of those. They also had epics, which were very long works of poetry that were very much narrative in nature. So they had multiple types of literature. But then on a more micro level, if you just look at plays, they had different kinds of plays. They had tragedies. They had comedies, right? They had some of those genres that we still have today. We don't necessarily I don't know that we use tragedy to define an entire genre anymore, but a lot of our movies, a lot of our literature definitely contain elements of tragedy, which were also largely defined by Aristotle. So catharsis, tragic heroes, tragic flaws. we still see all of that stuff. And contemporary literature, but all of that was sort of specific to the particular genre of tragedy, a particular type of play that was very popular in ancient Greece. So we still have some of those genres, but of course, a lot of additional genres have developed over the years. So if we want to get a little bit more specific, like we can just think about different genres of novels or different types of poetry. So we can get sort of as specific as we want when it comes to genre. There's sort of two levels. Like I said, the macro level is just like poetry, novels, plays, short stories, the four traditional types of literature. We can add more to that if we want to update that list, but those are the dominant traditional genres. But then within those genres, there's more genres. So with novels, traditional novel study would identify genres like the Gothic romance or the Bildungsroman, which is really just like a coming of age story. That's still pretty common today. There are sentimental novels, realistic novels, magical realism. Those could all be considered specific genres within the world of novels. Right. So we can get pretty specific with this stuff, and you guys might be a little more familiar with like common movie and TV show genres, which, you know, a lot of those also track onto works of literature. So we all know genres like horror, westerns, romantic comedies, science fiction, fantasy, right? We can find examples of all of those genres in film, TV, novels, other forms of literature, almost any type of, you know, popular artistic expression or, you know, piece of pop culture. So, you know, we all know genres. Again, this is something that we might not think about a whole lot, but we might have some genres that we prefer over others. And we might just recognize certain features of certain genres. That's really what's important, and that can sometimes be very important to our overall reading experience, right? The way we're going to respond to a horror movie, for example, has a lot to do with what we might call horror conventions. So if we pay money to go see a horror movie, we probably like horror movies, or we're with people who do. Maybe we got, you know, dragged along, but if we've seen horror movies before, if we're familiar with the genre, then we're going to have certain expectations when we go in to watch the movie. Right? We're going to expect, you know, scares like jump cuts that are going to make us jump. We're going to expect, you know, spooky plot developments. We're going to expect scary characters, maybe violence, suspense, you know, maybe certain musical cues. You know, this really applies to virtually every level of the viewing experience. We expect a certain type of plot, certain types of characters, certain types of music, certain kinds of camera work, certain kinds of writing. Like it really permeates all level. Now, not everybody will be looking for all of those, but if you're a fan of the genre, you kind of know what to expect. You kind of know what horror movies typically do. So that can be interesting. You can either observe how this movie is following the horror conventions to a T and really kind of emulating earlier versions of horror films, or you might notice that the movie is breaking conventions. Maybe this particular horror movie is surprising you because it's not doing a lot of the things that you would expect a horror movie to typically do. So that can lead to different reactions, different springboards for analysis. So those can just be interesting things to look for and observe. And again, you can do the same with novels, right? You can look at the coming of age story and how that's a very popular type of novel, particularly in America. Huck Finn is an example. I know we didn't really have a chance to read that one, but some of you might have read it earlier in life. That's a classic example of a coming of age story, right? A young character has various life experiences, some good, some bad, some comic, some frightening, perhaps. They learn, they grow, they develop. They're often somewhat disillusioned by adults and some of the bad things that they learn about the world, but ultimately, they achieve some kind of breakthrough or they just grow up and enter into a new phase of life. We can all probably think of examples of that genre. So you have to do more than just point out, hey, this novel's a Bildungsroman. It's a coming of age story. Okay, yes, but the next step would be to sort of analyze the genre a little bit more, or analyze this particular text's use of the genre, and just kind of interrogate the genre a little bit. Why do we like it so much? Why does it appeal to American audiences? How is this particular author using it? Those types of questions. And that can often spark some good analysis. So when it comes to genre study, I don't know that that can be your sole focus, but you can definitely use some genre study on your way to a larger analysis. That can definitely be a tool that you utilize in this class. But a lot of contemporary critics and scholars will point out that sometimes genres or genre conventions, like we were talking about earlier, can be sort of confining. They can be a little bit restrictive. And that's why some authors or some filmmakers want to break free of those restrictions. They want to do different things. So one key trend or development that we can notice with a lot of more modern literature is that we often have a blending of genres. So we're going to have a text that's not just one genre. It's got some elements of comedy. It's got some elements of horror. It's got some elements of romance. And it's kind of a blend of all of those different things. A lot of audiences enjoy that. I would say that's more common today than it used to be, but we can find older examples of genre blending. That's not a brand new thing, but I do think we see it more today. So some critics would argue genre doesn't always matter that much. Artists pick and choose. They sort of cherry pick the genres that they want, and they'll break some rules. They'll follow other rules. It really doesn't matter that much. And then some works of literature might not really be any identifiable genre. Some scholars say it's sometimes a little bit unproductive, counterproductive to try to pigeonhole a particular text into a genre if it doesn't really fit there. If this is a text that's just kind of weird and it's hard to categorize, we could just, that's fine. We could still talk about it. We can talk about why it's difficult to categorize, but we don't always have to shove it into a pre-made genre. And of course, there's also the possibility that we are creating new genres. Many people would argue that new genres are always getting created based on advancements, developments in society, changing reading habits, changing tastes. So that's another thing that could be interesting to consider. What are some genres that are developing now that might be sort of new or different from what we've had in the past? All right, so let's move on to number 3. The third traditional approach they talk about in chapter 2 is source study. Now, this is another one that I would say we're probably not going to do very much with it over the course of the semester, but some of you might want to, especially if you really like research, if you really like doing sort of detective work. This could be a fun one. So this is a traditional approach that's all about looking into if you're studying a particular text, let's say Frankenstein, this traditional approach is all about looking into earlier texts that might have influenced the text that you are studying. So this really has to do with tracing not just the composition of the text, that's also a little bit of what you might do with the old-fashioned textual study, but this is also tracing the sources, tracing all the influences on the author, all the texts that might have helped to contribute to the creation of the text that you are now studying. So you could be looking at a lot of different things for source study. You could go back to earlier drafts, notebooks, manuscripts, if any of that stuff still exists, but also sources. If you know some of the texts, some of the authors that were influential to the author and the text that you are studying, you can go and look at those sources. You can look at those other texts, read them, think about the relationships between what you're studying and these other influences that obviously impacted it in various ways. So with Frankenstein, you could definitely do this. And I kind of mentioned a few of the influences when we were first getting started. I mentioned that, Mary Shelley was married to Percy Shelley, who was a pretty famous member of the Romantic poetry movement of the early 19th century in England. So that was a particular sort of artistic movement that included Lord Byron. William Wordsworth is usually kind of associated with it, Coleridge, Keats to some extent. So you could read more about those Romantic poets. They had a certain philosophy about art that I sort of touched on very briefly with Mary Shelley, but we won't get into it now. You're a few keystrokes away from being able to learn all about it if you want to. And plenty of scholars have shown that a lot of those ideas that the Romantic poets held sort of showed up in the work of Mary Shelley. Now, Mary Shelley did not always necessarily agree with her husband and his buddies on all of their ideas, but she was listening, she was observing, and a lot of their ideas kind of showed up in her novels. Sometimes they were sort of criticized, other times they might have been praised more, or just, sort of put in the mouths of characters, just part of the tapestry that she was creating out of her own experiences, her own knowledge. But she has a lot of interesting influence beyond just her husband. Her parents were both pretty well known. I mentioned both of them before. Her mother was a well known feminist writer, her father was a philosopher. They both wrote and, spoke and had lots of ideas and had lots of other intellectuals and writers and artists come over to the house. So a lot of good work, as you can imagine, has already been done with this kind of source study on Frankenstein because Mary Shelley had an interesting life. She was surrounded by a lot of interesting people, a lot of influential thinkers, and she was a very skilled writer, so she was able to capture a lot of what was around her, and it sort of made its way into her literature, into her fiction. So you can do that kind of work. It involves a lot of digging, a lot of research. You have to be prepared to read a lot of other stuff. So again, this would be kind of scorned by the new critics because they were like, you're not even that interested in Frankenstein. You're actually reading all of these other books that might have influenced Frankenstein. But hey, that's still productive and interesting. It's just not the kind of literary study that most lit scholars do today, although some do it. Some still do it. I would call it a little old fashioned, sure, but some still do it. And if you guys really like to dig up older stuff, sort of reconstruct a history or a sort of lineage, it might be fun for you. You could definitely do at least some of that with some of your future work. All right. The next one is going to be useful, I think, for all of us to some extent. So, number 4, historical and biographical approaches. So, students still like both of these approaches very much. So, these have been around for a long time, like all of these traditional approaches. These have been used going back centuries, even before there was really a name for it, even before there was really an academic discipline surrounding literature. That's another part of the history that the book kind of shares with you guys in this chapter. And I think they mention it in the first chapter as well. Like what we think of as the study of literature in American colleges, that's really only been around for about a century, maybe a little bit longer in some places. Prior to that, they wouldn't have really studied English language literature in school. If you were not so much in college, like if you were going to be reading literature at the college level, like back in the 1800s, 1700s, you were reading the classics. And by that, we don't mean the American classics. We mean the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans. You would have had to have probably learned a little bit of Latin, maybe a little bit of Greek. So you could have read some of that stuff in the original. Obviously, we don't do a whole lot of that anymore. So there was a big shift in the early 20th century where the study of what was then considered more contemporary literature, American literature from the 1800s, early 1900s, started getting studied in college. And of course, now we take that for granted. But along with that, along with the study of American literature, other English language traditions of the last few centuries, you had a whole academic discipline grow up around that, which we would now call literary study, or a lot of what gets done in upper level English classes. But that academic discipline didn't really exist like 400 years ago, not the way it does now. So again, that's why the traditional approaches were used, because a lot of people studying literature would have been historians, or they would have been writing biographies, or they would have been philosophers, right? They would have done other things. They would have belonged to other older academic disciplines. And they were, studying a work of literature because of what it has to say about history, biography, philosophy, linguistics, or whatever the field might have been. But see, what starts to change once more contemporary literature gets taught, we get to have a sort of a more serious consideration of the literature itself. So again, going back to what we were saying before with the new critics, that's really what helps us develop what is now considered more modern literary study. But whether it's old or modern, we always think about history, at least to some extent. So this has always been around, and we still use the historical approach, although we will see some of the ways that the historical approach has changed. It's a little bit different now. Some of our ways of understanding history are a little bit different than they used to be, but we always like to use history as a tool or a lens to help us understand a work of literature. So, in some cases, we know this is like obviously important. Like if we're reading historical fiction, if we're reading something that is set in a previous time period, we know pretty instinctively that we need to learn a little bit about that time period. We need to have that context so we know what's going on in this place, in this time that's very different from our own. And sometimes in class, your teacher will provide some of that historical context for you, or you can use Wikipedia or Google searches for that. But anytime we're reading something that might be old in our mind, it was either written a long time ago or it was set a long time ago in terms of the setting, we're going to need some historical context. That's pretty imperative. But also with some poetry, that might be important as well, knowing more about the time period that it came from. Again, that will help inform you about genre. That might help you to understand some of the popular techniques of poetry during that time so you can better understand like what the author is doing and why. So we often need to know a little bit about this historical context. So that's always going to be helpful. And then if we want to use it as a lens for analysis, we usually can. We can usually find a way to do one of two things. And it kind of depends on what you see and what you think. But on one hand, you can talk about how the real history that's sort of influencing the literature, how that real history shows up in the text. How is the author using this famous war or this famous historical figure or this time period that is very much, important to the plot and the characters? How is all of that working? So you can see how the history gets reflected in the literature, or you can go the other way and you can see how the literature might, in some interesting ways, be reflected in the history. And I know that sounds a little odd, but I'm going to leave it there for now because we'll talk a lot more about historicism, the new historicism, kind of like the new historical approach that we can take today. It's not that different from the traditional approach, but we have updated it in a few important ways. So we'll spend a whole week on that later in the semester. But just know that you can always use history. History and literature are often pretty closely associated. Not always. You don't have to care about history to study literature, but many people who study literature are at least somewhat interested in the history that might be surrounding a particular work of literature. So those two disciplines, history and lit study, they go together pretty nicely, and there is often some overlap between them. So yeah, we like history. However, biography is a little bit more tricky. I wouldn't say you have to avoid it, but a lot of modern scholars and critics will say that the old fashioned biographical approach to literary study is kind of outdated and not super useful. So, what does that mean? Well, just basically studying the author, being really interested in the biography of the author, and maybe fitting the text into a larger narrative about the author's life. Again, we can imagine doing this kind of work with Mary Shelley, and you better believe that this kind of work has been done by quite a few scholars, and it's worthwhile because she had an interesting life. She had an interesting biography, and obviously Frankenstein's a big part of that because it's the most famous thing she ever wrote. But we could also learn more about the rest of her career. We could learn about the ways Frankenstein continued to affect her, how it sort of created a public perception of her, a reputation that might still persist to this day. We could learn more about her marriage, all that stuff. The fact that she became estranged from her father once she eloped with Percy, like I alluded to. So yeah, there's stuff there. It's interesting, but some, like the new critics, would maybe criticize this a little bit and say, yeah, but you're not interested in the text, right? You want to, focus on the author. There can be some value to that, but you're moving away from the text. You're not really analyzing Frankenstein. You're just using Frankenstein as a piece of maybe a larger life story. Although that doesn't have to be the way the biographical approach goes. You might be able to make some really sharp, observations about, how certain aspects of her biography might show up in the novel, might influence theme, character, symbolism. I mean, there's connections to be made for sure. And if you're ready to still work closely with the text, I think you can bring some biography in. I don't think there's anything wrong with using it a little bit, but I would just discourage you from focusing exclusively on the author's bio. That's never really the end point for us. We don't need to become experts on these authors' lives. You can definitely make biographical connections to specific things that you are seeing in the work of literature, but again, the bio is like a means to an end. It's like genre. It might not be the end all be all. It's not our ultimate or primary focus, but it is something we can analyze, talk about, and it might help us get to where we ultimately want to go. So that would be my advice on biography. But of course, you can always come to me if you want to do something with biography, if you want to tie in the author's life to some of the other analysis that you're doing. We can probably find some effective ways of doing that, but it might be something that you want to run by me. And then finally, the fifth approach that I wanted to talk about is what they call the moral slash philosophical approach. And this one is still with us. It's one that I'm not the biggest fan of. I guess on the philosophical side, sure. On the moral side, I think that's a little bit less promising, but we're still going to use a little bit of this. If nothing else, this is going to be part of our initial response. This is going to be a part of our, emotional reaction to a work of literature. Like I've said before, that initial emotional response is really the foundation. It's the first step towards real analysis. So a lot of times, one of the things we do instinctively when we're reading something is we look for theme. Right? We've talked about this. We always want to identify a key theme a key idea, one of the key like meanings or messages that a text is trying to get across to an audience. And we often do think of these as messages or like the moral of the story. You've probably heard that term before. It often gets applied to like fables or certain kinds of children's literature that's designed to be instructional. If you guys know what I mean by that, like if you think about a lot of children's lit, right? A lot of books written for kids, like younger kids, a lot of that stuff is designed to teach lessons, right? And we understand why. Like children are developing, they're learning, and these books are supposed to kind of reinforce, like important, like ideals about like sharing or I don't know, being nice to your siblings or, listening to your mom or like whatever. There's usually a moral to the story, and it's supposed to be an easily understood lesson or message that a child can sort of consume and understand, and hopefully it's going to have a positive influence on their future behavior and personality. It doesn't always work that way, but that's kind of the idea. So we all learn that when we're kids. We kind of learn that stories have morals, and you're supposed to be able to identify the moral at the center of a story. And that's fine when you're 7, 8, 9 years old. But I think that way of thinking kind of leads to problems later when we're reading more sophisticated works, when we're at higher levels of school, and we sometimes still have that paradigm, that idea of the moral of the story. Well, what's the moral? What's the message? What's the lesson? And yeah, some works of literature have lessons. They have morals. They have those clear messages that they are trying to get across to you. And you can analyze them, talk about them, apply them to the real world, whatever you want to do. That's certainly an option. But sometimes we might decide that some works of literature don't really have lessons. And remember that a theme doesn't always have to be a lesson. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the author is trying to instruct us in the proper way to be. But other times, the author might not really want to serve that instructional role. The author might not want to be sort of functioning like a teacher in that way. They might just want to raise interesting ideas. They want to make you think. They want to make you arrive at your own conclusions. They want to show you something. They want to maybe, bring attention to a particular problem, or they want to show you part of just human life that is difficult, and they want you to get a different perspective on it. There might not really be a lesson in that traditional sense. So you could sometimes drive yourself crazy looking for something that's not really there. So it is up to you as the reader to interpret the theme and to figure out if it really is designed to be a moral or if it's just designed to be something that we can think about. So I'll give you two examples, both from the same book. Think about a couple of the major themes that we discussed in Frankenstein, right? One of the first ones that we identified was isolation, alienation, being cut off from society, right? The monster experiences it. Victor experiences it. Walton experiences it, right? It has been well established now by critics and scholars that Mary Shelley wanted us to understand the corrosive effects of like that kind of alienation, that kind of isolation. So we would consider that one of the major sort of thematic content, some of the major thematic content of the book, one of the major themes. But is there a lesson to go along with that? Is there a real moral to go along with that? I don't know. I mean, you might interpret it as don't be alone, don't be isolated because bad things will happen. But beyond that, I'm not sure that there's really a moral. It might be kind of a caution, or it might just be an exploration of a very common human problem that we still encounter today. Many people struggle with it. So sometimes authors don't necessarily have answers. And again, that bothers readers sometimes if we're always thinking there's a lesson. If I don't get the lesson, then I failed. But some authors are just raising things, like I said, raising questions, raising things to consider. They don't necessarily have solutions. They don't necessarily have it all figured out. They're trying to work through it too. They're just showing it to you. And then it's up to you what you want to do with it. So I think that's what Shelley's doing with the alienation theme. However, another key theme, exceeding the bounds of human knowledge, right? We talked about that. Violating nature's law, doing things that humans shouldn't do. Again, it's a general idea because Walton falls victim to it too. Unbridled ambition, wanting to accomplish things that nobody else has accomplished, wanting fame, wanting recognition, all of that stuff. At the end of the book, we hear Victor tell Walton, don't be so ambitious, right? There's more to life than fame and pushing the limits of human understanding. So, there, I think we could make more of a case that there's a lesson, right? There is a lesson. There's a sort of a message or a moral that Shelley might want to get across to her readers. Like, this kind of behavior is destructive. Don't engage in this kind of behavior. Science is great. Discovery is great. Learning new things, innovation, all great. But there is a limit. So if we perceive that as another key theme, we might think, all right, that's a lesson. That's more of a moral that readers can take with them, and it might guide our own behavior, or it might just be a good principle to live by. But not all themes are going to work that way. So just be prepared. Some themes might just be raising an alarm, right? Asking questions, showing you something, and then other themes might deliver that kind of moral or lesson that we often expect. But that was really key to one of these to this traditional approach to literature. In olden times, a lot of literature was sort of required to have a moral. Because, like we've been saying, literature was not always appreciated in and of itself as a work of art. It was a vehicle for delivering some larger truth about something else. So, a lot of times, the value of the literature was really measured by the moral. Does it have a good moral? Is there a good lesson here for the readers? And if not, some critics might have dismissed the literature and said, well, it's no good. We don't really evaluate literature that way anymore. Like, we don't make a determination about how good something is based on how good of a moral it has. Now, I mean, some individual readers might be driven by that, but when we're doing literary study, when we're trying to really evaluate, analyze, and interpret, we can certainly talk about morals, but we're not going to, rank the novels or judge the novels strictly, or the literature, any kind of literature, based strictly on the morals, right? I mean, again, we used to do that, especially when novels came out or got big sort of beginning in the 18th century, at least if we're talking about English language novels. You guys maybe have read this, but when novels first became a big type of literature, there was a lot of consternation, a lot of worry that they were corrupting the youth, very much like what you would hear later about TV and the internet and social media. You actually heard it about novels back in the 1700s, because it was, novels were often kind of scary because they could be really realistic. They could often feature like scandalous plot lines, sort of behavior that maybe, wasn't deemed socially acceptable back then. And often young people were reading them. So there was this real concern that young people reading novels might start acting very badly. They were going to be corrupted. They were going to learn all of these bad lessons. So there was this real emphasis placed on novels having morals, having lessons that they could share with the reader, so the reader would not be, a bad person afterwards. And if you actually look at old novels from the 1700s, they'll often have a little note at the beginning written by the author that will often basically say this novel teaches good proper conduct or some variation of that. This novel is intended to teach young people what not to do, or some variation of that kind of statement, because that was important back then. You needed to claim that your novel had a lesson, and then it could be sort of scandalous, sordid. It could have all kinds of objectionable content, as long as you had that moral. Hey, we're learning, right? There's a lesson. It could kind of be accepted, and it would escape the censors, and it would be able to go out and be sold. So that's just a little rough history. I'm skipping over a lot, but that is a big part of the history of the novel. When they first got big, a lot of people were like, oh, novels, very, very scandalous, very, very bad influence on young people. We don't really think of it that way anymore. But again, that's because back then works of literature really were supposed to have a moral. Now we're a lot more flexible. If they have a moral, great. If they don't have a moral, that's fine. All right. That's fine too. We can still enjoy it. We can still analyze it and interpret it. But again, remember that some themes, instead of being direct lessons or morals, really, they might be tapping into more of a philosophical sort of debate, or they might just be it might just be a bigger idea. It might be a chance to explore some kind of larger truth. So those answers can be elusive, and that's why we have a lot of responsibility to interpret. And see, you'll notice this, like when there's a really clear moral, really clear lesson, it actually takes away some of our ability to conduct original analysis and arrive at an original interpretation, because it's kind of obvious, right? There's a moral, there's a lesson, we see it. It's probably already been discovered, and there might only be so much we can do with it. But when we do arrive at a theme that feels a little bit more open-ended, then we have a lot more room to interpret. We have a lot more room to come up with our own conclusions, our own theories, and to really figure out what the meaning is. So it works well both ways, but just be prepared for both of those possibilities. Finding themes that do have clear moral instruction, and then finding the themes that don't. Be able to work with both as we move along. All right, so I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover for the traditional approaches. So next week, we're going to get into formalism, the new critics. So I already talked about them a little bit today. They really kicked off the modern study of literature as we know it in America, but their critical school is not the only show in town anymore. It might have been the first really modern one, but a lot of other critical schools have come up since then. And we might prefer some of the more recent ones, but we're going to start with formalism because it's really foundational to literary study. It's going to keep us inside the text so we can really pay attention to specific literary elements, specific devices. And as we move along to different schools, we'll be able to move into some other areas, take a broader approach. The formalist new critical approach is very narrow, but I think it's going to be fun, and it will be useful as we're building our analytical skills. It will get us more comfortable really dealing closely with literary texts. So again, we'll be able to go back to his coy mistress and back to Frankenstein and do a little bit more close textual analysis of those texts using the formalist approach. So that's next week. If you have any questions or concerns, let me know, and I'll see you soon.